That night no one tried to sleep. Ren Hale sat with encrypted equipment spread across folding tables, screens glowing with location pings, updating every second. Law enforcement vehicles gathered silently along the property line, lights off. Volunteers moved quietly, afraid to disturb the brittle silence. Lyra stayed beside the horse. She felt him growing restless long before the clock turned. His breathing changed. Muscles tightened. Sweat darkened the coat around his neck, though the air was cold. He lifted his head, ears fixed sharply forward, staring at something no one else could see. His heartbeat hammered through the floor. Then the barn lights flickered. 3:16 a.m. The scream erupted again, a violent rupture of sound that shook rafters and rattled glass panes. The horse lunged upward in terror, hooves striking air, legs collapsing beneath him. His body contorted, as if reliving bindings against bone. But this time, the scream was not alone. Ren Hale's screen lit up. A signal, coordinates active. The chip was communicating with something outside the barn, a receiver waking, somewhere not far. Law enforcement moved fast and silent, splitting into tactical teams, moving into the dark like shadows with purpose. Engines ignited without headlights, tires ripping gravel, vehicles disappearing down back roads, barely wide enough for one truck. The scream continued, rising higher, piercing the ribs like metal wire tightening. Lyra placed her hands against the horse's neck, tears blurring her sight, whispering breathless promises that he was safe. He was here, he was not alone. And slowly, impossibly, the scream softened, not silenced, but pulled back from the edge. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the radio crackled through static. Multiple victims recovered. Several restrained inside a livestock trailer hidden in an abandoned quarry pit. Alive, traffickers fleeing on foot. Backup requested. Lyra pressed her forehead to the horses as his trembling began to ease. His breathing slowed, no longer frantic, but exhausted, like something massive had finally released its grip. The clock read 3:21 a.m. The screaming stopped, for the first time. He lowered his head into Lyra's arms, not collapsing from weakness, but leaning with trust. A moment so quiet and fragile it felt like touching glass that could shatter under breaths. Outside, sirens rose in the distance, not a warning, but a victory cry. The darkness had started to break, and Hollow Ridge would never be the same. Dawn bled slowly across the horizon, a muted gray trembling through fog that hung low over the Hollow Ridge Valley like breath trapped beneath glass. Exhaustion weighed on everyone in the barn. Officers slumped against truck doors, volunteers leaning against stalls. Ren Hale hunched over glowing screens, tracing incoming updates through encrypted channels. But beneath the fatigue lived something electric, something hot and bright, something like purpose. Survivors had been found, real people, real lives, breathing. The rescue footage arrived through Ren's tablet, a grainy night vision green that rendered human shapes ghost-like. Figures pulled from the trailer huddled together in blankets, faces hollow, eyes wide in disbelief. Young, terrifyingly young, some barely able to stand, limbs shaking too violently to hold their own weight. Their wrists bore the same deep circular grooves the horse carried on his legs. Matching scars, matching captivity, matching suffering. The quarry site was revealed to be a staging point, a middle link along a chain of transport designed to move silently through rural land where no one watched and no one asked questions. The trailer interior was modified, false walls, welded compartments, blind locking mechanisms operated only from outside. No windows, no ventilation, no sound could escape. It was designed not to transport livestock, but to erase existence. The victims had been moved at midnight. The horse had once been restrained near them. Their terror lived on the same timeline, 3:17 a.m. While the survivors were transporting to medical facilities and therapists arrived to stabilize them, law enforcement continued sweeping through the region. Arrests multiplied across 3 counties within hours. Property seizures began. Warrants secured. Trails that once hid beneath decades of unchecked rural silence were suddenly exposed under unforgiving lights. Each update brought another crack in the darkness. But immense cruelty leaves debris, and the emotional fallout hung thick in the air, like the smell of burned wood refusing to fade. The horse remained motionless in his stall, body collapsing into deep sleep that looked too heavy to be natural, a creature whose muscles remembered torment long after freedom arrived. Even unconscious, he twitched violently at unseen memories. His leg jerked as though pulling against steel cuffs. His breath hitched in uneven stutters. Lyra sat beside him, back against the stall wall, legs pulled tightly to her chest. She should have slept. Every cell in her body screamed for rest. Instead, she watched the gentle rise and fall of his ribs, terrified to blink in case he disappeared. Some animals survived wounds the body could heal. Others carried wounds only time could stitch shut. But trauma that returns in the same minute every night was something different, something carved into the architecture of memory. Outside the barn, the sky bled into bruised purple. Officers came and went, radios barking coded updates into the cold. Wren remained steady through it all, sharp, collected, relentless, but when she paused beside the stall door, something human fractured through the professionalism. She looked at the horse not as evidence, not as a lead, not as a component. She looked at him like a soldier who had survived a war no one witnessed, because that's what he was. The next 24 hours changed everything. One of the rescued victims, a teenage boy, regained consciousness long enough to speak through trembling lips. His voice was shredded raw, but he fought each syllable like another step through a battlefield. He had seen the horse before. He had heard the screaming through metal walls. He had seen men restraining him, attaching something to his spine before shipping him out again. He had counted days by the only measurable event they had, the screams at 3:17 a.m. The horse hadn't just remembered trauma. He was reliving the precise clockwork schedule of suffering, synchronized with the movements of shipments underway. His mind and body had become timepieces of horror. But something changed when the victims were rescued. Something unexplainable. Something that did not belong in logic alone. When the boy described the last trailer departure, the final group of captives being driven out of the quarry, he said something that froze Lyra's breath in her chest. The last truck pulled away at 3:17 a.m. The exact night the horse's scream changed, not pain, not panic, but breaking the cycle, breaking the ritual. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random instinct. It was memory aligned with reality. The horse was tied to events beyond his stall walls, bound to more than physical space. His suffering was connected to theirs, but now they were free. And something inside him knew before any human said the words. That night, the barn fell into an uneasy quiet. Volunteers stayed close, beds rolled out in aisles. Emergency lights glowed soft and amber. Wren Hale positioned equipment to monitor the chip and the coordinates of its last transmission. Preparations hung thick in the air like the stillness before a storm breaks. The horse did not thrash. He did not tremble. He did not scream. Instead, he lifted his head slowly, eyes clearing as if a veil lifted, breath deepening into rhythm. the first peaceful inhale since his arrival. Lyra placed her palm gently on his cheek, feeling warmth return to skin that had felt like marble beneath her fingers. He leaned into the touch with a softness that broke her chest open. Outside, wind rustled the trees. Inside, silence filled the barn like a prayer. The clock on the wall ticked toward the hour Lyra feared with every beat of her heart. 3:15 a.m., 3:16 a.m. Every volunteer held their breath. Every animal went still. 3:17 a.m. Nothing, no scream, no shaking, no terror reappearing like a ghost through flame. Instead, the horse exhaled, a long, slow, shuddering release of air, as if finally letting go of something buried so deeply it had become bone. Then he lowered his head onto the bedding, eyes closing with trust, and fell into a deep, unbroken sleep. For the first time, a sleep without nightmares, a sleep without chains. Lyra's vision blurred beneath tears she could no longer blink away. The barn lights steadied, the building breathed. And somewhere far off, police radio confirmed the message every soul in that barn already felt inside their bones. Every victim had been found. Every survivor was safe. The horror ended at the exact minute the screaming ended. 3:17 a.m., the time the world changed, and the horse who had endured months of hell had not cried out again. He did not need to. His purpose had been fulfilled. Word spread fast, faster than officials could contain, faster than newsrooms could format headlines. A story like this did not travel quietly. It roared, it ignited. It carved a path through public consciousness like a lit match to gasoline. The burned barn, the restrained horse, the implant, the synchronized screams, the discovery of human trafficking victims hidden inside livestock transport, the raid that saved them at the exact moment the horse broke the cycle. People needed a face for the story. They found it in him. Media vans parked along rural fences. Reporters hovered in crowds kept back by law enforcement tape. Letters and donations poured in from strangers desperate to believe something good still existed in the world. Rescue organizations offered support. Criminal networks trembled. But Lyra did not care about headlines. She cared only about the quiet miracle breathing behind the stall door. The horse stood steadily on weakened legs, eyes alert, body healing, scars visible, but no longer defining him. The worst injuries remained, burns that would never fully smooth, bone misaligned at the fetlock that would forever change his gait. But pain alone did not decide the future. He had survived something designed to erase him. He had endured when no one heard his scream. He had carried the memories of others when no one else could. And when the world needed him most, he answered. Lyra rested her forehead gently against his. She closed her eyes and felt warmth radiate through both of them. The barn felt lighter, safer, fuller. The air no longer held storm pressure. Something lifted, something released. He wasn't nobody anymore. He was the key, the witness, the shield, the miracle, the horse who refused to die. For days after the raid, the world spun around hollow ridge-like planets orbiting a single burning star. Reporters begged for statements. Activists organized campaigns. Lawmakers drafted motions. Donations arrived faster than Lyra could document. Handwritten notes folded between bills and coins. Messages from strangers who said the horse's survival reminded them that hope was not naive, it was necessary. But inside the barn, the noise of the outside world faded to a hum beyond wooden walls. Life returned to a quieter rhythm. Horses chewed hay, dogs slept in soft piles. The sun stretched long beams across the dust particles, floating lazily in warm light. Peace, fragile but real, found its way back home. The horse healed in body the same way survivors healed in spirit. Slowly, unevenly, with days when progress seemed impossible, and others when light burst through the dark like flame through paper. The burns on his flanks scabbed, then regenerated into new skin. The deep grooves around his legs filled slowly, scar tissue forming raised pale rings like bracelets etched by suffering. The injury at his fetlock would never fully correct, leaving one hind hoof dragging slightly, but he moved easier now, with determination that replaced desperation. He lifted his head when Lyra entered the stall, greeting her not with fear but recognition. He followed her with a steady gaze, ears flicking toward her footsteps rather than the ghosts of memory. The hollow emptiness that once consumed his eyes gradually filled with something gentler, not joy yet, but the beginning of trust. The survivors rescued from the quarry remained under medical care, names withheld, stories sealed behind trauma-sensitive protection. But their recovery flowed in parallel with his, each milestone mirrored by another. A girl who had been unable to speak since the raid whispered her first words the same day the horse took his first unassisted steps. A boy who flinched from human touch walked forward to place a hand against the stall gate the morning the horse allowed his halter to be removed. Healing echoed across lives like a chord struck in harmony. 2 weeks after the raid, Hale returned, no longer carrying equipment or escorting tactical vehicles. She walked with the heavy stillness of someone who had spent hours signing statements, briefing departments, testifying behind closed doors. The world had changed because of what happened in Hollow Ridge, but change came wrapped in grief and weight. She approached the stall where Lyra stood brushing the horse's neck, loose strands of white and soot-gray hair lifting into the air. Ren watched them quietly for a long moment before speaking softly, not with authority, but with reverence. She said survivors had been asking about him. She said they wanted to meet the animal who had held the memories they could not bear alone. She said they wanted to give him something that no case file, no news report, no legal document could offer. They wanted to give him his name. It was not chosen for the suffering he endured. It was not chosen for the pain he witnessed. It was chosen for the miracle he became. They named him Beacon, because in the darkest place he lit the way out, a signal, a survivor, a guide. Beacon lifted his head when he heard the word, ears forward, breath steady. It settled onto him like truth, fitting the shape of his spirit the way light fits sunrise. Beacon, a name for a life that refused to disappear. The rescue center overflowed with people the day of the dedication, survivors wrapped carefully in blankets, families holding hands, officers standing silently in uniform, volunteers who had not rested since the night of the fire, neighbors who had never known what horrors lived hidden in their valley. The world watched through cameras broadcasting across countries, not for spectacle, but for proof that miracles could rise from ashes. Lyra led Beacon into the open arena, sun warming the ridges of his spine, wind lifting his mane in soft currents. His gait was uneven, but strong, each step grounded in determination. Scars marked him like constellations on pale skin, a topography of pain transformed into testimony. He walked past crowds who fell silent, not out of pity, but reverence. A gentle cheer rose, not loud, not overwhelming, a wave of human breath lifting toward the sky. Survivors moved forward, some limping, some shaking, some held upright by others, forming a circle around him. They reached out cautious hands, and Beacon lowered his head so each could touch him, bowing like a knight before royalty. Tears spread through the crowd like rain through dust. Ren Hale stepped to a microphone and spoke words that carried across air heavy with emotion. She said that this horse had become the key to dismantling one of the most sophisticated trafficking routes uncovered in decades. She said the survivors were alive because an animal refused to die in silence. She said that sometimes the smallest voices break the largest chains. And she said something else, something quiet, something powerful. Heroes do not always stand on two legs. Beacon lifted his head then, eyes deep and luminous, and the crowd fell into reverent stillness. In that silence, he did something no one expected. He stepped forward on his injured leg, a step that should have buckled, a step his body had not managed in months. He took a second, and then a third, 3 steps, the number that mattered. Each step was a declaration, it is finished. The arena erupted, applause crashing like thunder, tears shattering like glass, voices rising in a roar of triumph. Beacon stood in the center, unwavering, free. Weeks later, the rescue center found peace again, not silence, peace. The kind that lives after battle ends, after wounds scar, after fear loosens its grip. Survivors found new homes. Therapy animals were introduced to their recovery. Laws changed because of what happened at Hollow Ridge. Funds arrived that saved the rescue from closure. Beacon roamed the pasture now, moving slowly but proudly across open land, tail lifting in the morning air. He grazed beside other horses, no longer isolated by trauma. The ghosts that once lived in his eyes had dissolved into softness. Lyra often watched him at sunset, leaning against the fence, hands curled around warm wire, heart lighter than she thought possible. Wind streamed through the field, bending tall grass around his legs like waves around stone. Sometimes he lifted his head, ears flicking in her direction, acknowledging the space she held in his healing. She believed something now that she never believed before. Some lives are pulled from death because they have work left to do. Some souls return because someone is waiting. Some miracles walk on 4 legs. Pain does not end the moment chains break. Healing is not the absence of scars. Trauma is not erased by daylight. But what darkness builds, love can dismantle. What cruelty buries, courage can unearth. What suffering silences, truth can resurrect. A single voice can be lost. A single cry can be ignored. But endurance echoes. And sometimes the bravest survivor is the one who cannot speak. Beacon taught the world this. No one is too broken to be saved. No life is too small to change history. And sometimes, the miracle is not how we rescue them, but how they rescue us. Some cries for help do not come from human voices. Some rise from darkness, from ashes soaked in gasoline and fear, from the places everyone else has already abandoned. Some arrive in the night when sleep should protect the mind, demanding to be heard. This is the story of a horse found alone inside the blackened bones of a burned-out barn. A horse who screamed every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. A horse whose survival uncovered a truth darker than smoke and deeper than fire. And this is the story of the woman who refused to look away. The storm had broken over Hollow Ridge sometime after midnight, tearing across the rural valley with wind sharp enough to strip branches and rain heavy enough to erase tire tracks. Lightning cracked above the hills, illuminating abandoned farmhouses and rusted trailers that once fed families and now fed only weeds. Roads washed with mud flowed like rivers in places. Most people were home, lights off, trying not to notice how loud the wind sounded against glass. But at the Hollow Ridge Equine Recovery Center, there was no sleep. There never was. Not when there were mouths to feed, wounds to treat, bills overdue, and hearts broken in ways stitches could not repair. Lyra Maddox moved through the barn aisle with slow, heavy steps, fatigue hanging from her shoulders like soaked cloth. At 27, she already felt far older, not in years, but in weight carried. Running a rescue meant living on caffeine, grit, and stubbornness the world could not bleach out. Her boots scuffed against concrete as she checked the last stall, blankets tight, heat lamps on, water full, medication logged. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the rafters. The barn lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Outside, wind howled like something alive, tugging at loose tin and rattling shutters. One of the rescued dogs whined at the noise, but Lyra reached down, running a hand along his head until his trembling eased. Storms always woke the broken ones, horses that had been beaten, starved, abandoned at kill auctions. Trauma reacted to thunder the way old wounds reacted to weather. Lightning flashed again, and the phone on her hip buzzed violently, an emergency call at nearly 2 a.m. No one called at this hour unless something was very wrong. The sheriff's voice came through broken static, the reception barely clinging to life between the hills. A property fire had been called in, an old barn deep in the back country past Hollow Ridge, off a road not on maps. The building had burned to its bones days ago, maybe weeks. No one knew who owned it anymore. Someone exploring the ruins had found something horrifying inside, tied to a support beam left standing. A horse, barely alive, still tied when everything else around him had burned. Lyra was already grabbing keys before the sheriff finished speaking. Rain hammered the truck windshield as she drove, headlights cutting swathes through darkness thick as oil. Every mile deeper into the back country shrank the world around her, until trees swallowed both shoulders of the road, and the storm was the only sound left. When she reached the property, emergency vehicles flashed red and blue against black skeletal remains of the barn. The structure stood like a charred cage stripped of flesh, beams twisted upward like ribs of a dead creature. Smoke still clung to the air, mixing with wet ash and burnt hair, the kind of smell that lived inside lungs long after leaving. Flashlights flickered between broken boards and black coals. The mud beneath her boots sucked like hands trying to pull her down. Then she saw him. A horse stood shaking violently against the last upright post, thick rope cutting deep grooves into his skin where he had fought against restraint. His coat was gray beneath the soot but patchy, burned in places down to shiny raw tissue. His flanks quivered, ribs showing sharply through taut skin. He leaned heavily to one side, unable to bear weight on one leg that bent wrong, as though something inside had been forced to break long before the fire ever touched the wood. His eyes were wide, not wild, not panicked, hollow. The eyes of something beyond fear. The eyes of something that had given up long before help arrived. Rain fell hard against his face, but he did not blink. He did not move when Lyra approached. He did not react when hands cut the rope from around his neck. It was as if the body still lived, but the soul had already walked out through the smoke. Behind him, black ash was stamped with marks, lines carved deep in the mud, like the drag of hooves chained or restrained. It looked like he had been tied there for a very long time, long enough to wear grooves into the ground, long enough to hear something on the other side of those burned walls screaming and not be able to run. There were no other animals, no bodies, no prints to explain anything, only silence and the crackle of burned wood collapsing inward. The horse did not resist the sling that lifted him into the trailer. His weight hung limp in the harness, too weak to stand. The sheriff shook his head as they closed the doors, rain turning everything into dripping black ink. There had been fires before in Hollow Ridge, loss before, cruelty before. Lyra had seen humans do things to animals that could hollow a person from the inside. But something about that horse, something about the way he did not struggle, unsettled her deeply. She kept glancing at the clock on the radio as she drove back. Something gnawed at her, a number repeating itself in her thoughts, though she did not know why. 3:17 a.m. She didn't know yet what that meant. She would within hours. And she would never forget it. The horse collapsed the moment he touched the bedding inside the quarantine stall. When Lyra loosened the halter, he did not even lift his head. His sides heaved sharply, lungs fighting for rhythm, breath coated in soot and smoke. Up close, the burns were worse, not just surface scorch, but layer upon layer of old and new. Burns that came long before the barn fire. But what caught her attention most were the marks around his legs. Not rope burns, not wire injuries from fencing or panicked escape attempts. Indentations, symmetrical, deep, uniform, circular. The shape of metal restraints bolted tight for weeks, maybe months, until flesh grew around the edges. The hair had rubbed away, skin had split, muscle had begun breaking down beneath constant pressure. No creature should endure that and remain breathing. Lyra whispered a silent promise inside her ribs, a vow the world would never hear, but the heart would carry. She ran a hand gently along his neck, feeling every ridge of bone beneath skin that felt too thin to contain the weight of a life. His pulse fluttered beneath her fingers, fast and weak like the wings of a trapped bird. The vet arrived within the hour, and the barn buzzed with quiet urgency. Fluid bags hung, dressings were applied, burn cream smoothed across raw skin. Sedatives entered veins that looked like cracked riverbeds. Every touch was careful, reverent, afraid to cross some invisible threshold where pain would spill into terror. He did not try to bite, or kick, or flee. He simply lay there, breathing in shallow stutters. When the vet lifted a scanner to check for any ID chip, the horse convulsed violently, a full-body tremor that shook the stall, knocking instruments to the floor. The volunteers stepped back instinctively, expecting a fight, but the horse did not lash out. He screamed. The sound ripped through the barn like something alive, high-pitched and piercing, the sound of something breaking from the inside. It reverberated through every beam and into the blood of everyone who heard it. It wasn't the scream of pain. It was something older, something raw, something that belonged to nightmares. Then he went still again, chest rising fast, eyes staring at nothing. The scanner passed over the base of his spine. It beeped. Not a typical chip, not an ID register. The vet frowned, adjusting the device and rescanning. It beeped again. But the numbers that appeared were not equine registration codes. They were different, coded, encrypted, something military, something technological, something not meant for animals. They exchanged a look heavy with dread. Rain hammered the roof. Wind slammed the barn doors. The clock ticked slow seconds into the silence. Lyra logged the time of scan automatically as she documented vitals, never thinking twice about what she was writing. 3:17 a.m. The exact minute the scream had begun. She didn't know yet that it would happen again. Not once, not twice, but every night. At exactly the same time. The storm had moved on by dawn, leaving the world washed and quiet in that unsettling way disasters often do. The rescue center sat in unnatural stillness, as though holding its breath. Even the animals seemed reluctant to break the silence, as though they sensed something hovering just outside human understanding. Lyra tried to rest, but her mind gnawed relentlessly. The barn fire, the restraints, the strange chip. The scream that did not sound like it came from a living throat. And the time, 3:17. She told herself it was a coincidence. She told herself she was overtired. She told herself animals cry out in pain. She did not believe any of it. That night she slept in the barn office, head resting on folded arms, exhaustion dragging her downward like an anchor. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward the hour she did not want to reach. 3:16 a.m. A low, shuddering rumble rolled through the quiet. Not thunder, not wind. Something rising like pressure building beneath floors, tightening the air, bending the atmosphere until even breath felt too heavy to draw. Then it came, the scream. It ripped through the barn so violently the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Horses in nearby stalls reared and slammed against doors, hooves striking walls in terror. Dogs began barking wildly, spinning in nervous circles. Lyra bolted upright, heart pounding against her ribs like fists. The scream grew higher, sharper, vibrating through wood and metal, rattling every object not bolted down. It was a sound that did not belong inside a barn. It was on fire, in darkness, in places where hope burned to ash. And then silence, not fading, cut off. Lyra stumbled into the stall, chest heaving, palms shaking. The horse lay rigid, muscles locked, eyes wide open and unseeing. His body trembled violently, foam thick around his mouth, breath rapid and shallow. The clock on the wall glowed. 3:17 a.m. Exactly, not a second more. Not a second less. Lyra knelt beside him, unable to understand what she felt, terror or sorrow or something worse. Something like recognition that something far larger than she knew had opened its eyes and looked back at her. The horse stared through the air like he was watching something burning only he could see. She whispered the same promise again, quiet, fierce, desperate. He blinked. Once, and in that blink she saw it. He wasn't screaming from physical pain. He was remembering. Whatever happened at 3:17 a.m. had not ended when the barn burned. It was still happening inside his mind. And tomorrow night it would return, and the night after, and the night after that. Until someone found out why. Morning crept slowly into the rescue barn, thin pale light seeping through the east windows like smoke drifting under a closed door. The animals remained unsettled, shifting restlessly as if waiting for another unseen blow to land. Even the air felt different, charged, fractured, like something had cracked open but not yet broken fully. Lyra sat on an overturned feed bucket outside the stall, elbows on her knees, hands pressed against her temples. She hadn't slept, not really. Every time she closed her eyes, the scream vibrated through her bones again, echoing as if the walls themselves remembered the sound. The horse lay stretched on the bedding, chest rising in shallow waves, eyes half closed but never truly resting. When the vet returned that morning, exhaustion shadowed her face too. She examined the restrained marks again, tracing each indentation with gloved fingers. The pattern was intentional, equal spacing, equal depth, identical placement on each limb. Instruments designed to hold, designed to immobilize. Not something a person panicked in cruelty would improvise, something engineered, manufactured, built for restraint. The vet looked uneasy. She lifted the scanner again and passed it slowly across the horse's spine. Beep. The encrypted ID appeared, but the rescue software could not interpret the code. It wasn't a veterinary chip. It wasn't livestock tracking. It wasn't foreign import identification. Lyra emailed images of the code to every contact. She had ever begged support from military friends, rescue organizations, a technician who once worked in prosthetics. One response came within minutes. It wasn't from her contacts. It wasn't even addressed properly. It simply read, "Do not remove the implant. It is transmitting. I'm on my way." Below the message was a location ping, government network signature, untraceable sender. Lyra's stomach tightened. Fear and curiosity braided together, indistinguishable. She stepped back into the stall, kneeling beside the horse. She watched the faint tremor in his muscles, the slow drag of his injured leg when he shifted. His ears twitched constantly, scanning sounds no one else reacted to: distant trucks, metal gates, dogs barking, always listening, always bracing. He bore the posture of an animal waiting to be hurt again. But beneath the wreckage, something else lived, a faint ember beneath ash, hunger for something not offered in months, safety. Lyra reached out, placing a hand against the base of his neck. His skin flinched, but he did not pull away. He turned his head slowly toward her, eyes dark and heavy, but clearer than they had been the night before. She checked the clock again. Hours until 3:17 a.m. Hours until the scream returned. She wasn't ready. No one could be ready. Still, she promised silently that he would not face it alone. By early afternoon, a black SUV rolled onto the gravel drive, tires crunching softly, engine humming low. No agency markings, no lights. A woman stepped out, tall, precise, dressed not in uniform, but in plain, dark clothing that carried authority without needing an emblem or badge. She introduced herself as Special Agent Ren Hale, Federal Task Force, Major Criminal Trafficking Division. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the barn not with suspicion, but with recognition, like she had stood in spaces like this before. She asked a few questions. She walked directly to the horse. And when she passed the scanner over the implant and read the returning code, her face changed, not shock, not confusion, fury. She exhaled slowly, gripping the device so tight her knuckles whitened. The implant was not identification. It was a transmitter, a specialized encrypted GPS relay used in covert monitoring operations, not military, not law enforcement. Black market technology, unregistered, untraceable, designed to piggyback invisibly on legitimate radio frequencies. It was used where surveillance equipment couldn't be placed. It was used where people couldn't be followed. It was used to track movement through remote, rural, border-adjacent regions. It was used to move something or someone undetected. Human trafficking victims, transporting through isolated farmland, hidden inside cargo compartments, moved under cover of livestock shipments, and the horses, beacons, unlawful, invisible carriers, organic camouflage. Nobody scans horses for contraband. Nobody questions horse trailers at rural checkpoints. And the horse in Lyra's barn, he wasn't collateral. He wasn't abandoned by accident. He was part of a route, a living map, a witness. Every scream at 3:17 a.m. wasn't a random panic. It was a memory, the exact time his last journey stopped, the moment everything went wrong. Ren Hale's voice fell low, steady as a blade sliding free from sheath. Somewhere near Hollow Ridge, people were still being moved. Somewhere, victims were still trapped. Somewhere, someone believed no one would ever connect the pattern. But they hadn't counted on survival. They hadn't counted on a horse crawling out of fire. They hadn't counted on a rescue facility refusing to walk away. Ren tapped into the implant signal. The display pulsed with intermittent transmission bursts, coordinates, movement patterns, not random at all. Lyra's breath stalled. The transmission coincided with the screams. Every night, 3:17 a.m. Someone was using that chip at that hour. Someone was activating something. Someone out there was still moving people through the dark. Every night his terror returned because somewhere the event replayed. Somewhere someone else relived it. Somewhere another human screamed too silently to be heard. Until now.